Hello, I'm going to read an essay on Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov that I wrote back in my junior year of college. It was for a class on American literature in the second half of the 20th century. I fixed a few tiny errors that I should have caught before submitting the paper. Other than that, I've left it as it is. Unfortunately, I can't say for sure what the prompt is. At the top, I only wrote topic number 5, but I think it was choose a section of the book that you think is the most representative of the book as a whole and explain why it is. I think only people who've read Pale Fire are going to be able to follow this essay, and you should totally check out Pale Fire. I didn't like it as much as Lolita. I think its experimental structure makes it a little more difficult to read, but it's short, so it doesn't overstay its welcome. I didn't feel like doing a whole lot of editing, but luckily, Ana de Armas holds a copy of the book in Blade Runner 2049, so I'm just going to let you look at her. I'll also put the text on the screen. Just so you know, the page numbers refer to the version published by Vintage International. Pale Fire. Topic number 5. Submitted October 26th, 2015. There is no passage more representative of Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire as a whole than Charles Kinbote's note to the 493rd line of the poem. The line in the poem is in the second to last stanza of Canto 2, and its subject is Hazel Shade, the daughter of John Shade, Kinbote's friend and author of Pale Fire. It is in this section that Kinbote writes about suicide as a spiritual situation. Within its boundaries, we see all of the characteristics of the entire novel. Among others, there are allusions to older works of literature, wordplay, a narcissistic appropriation of a significant autobiographical experience of Shade's on Kinbote's part, which he uses to expound on his own views rather than offer an explanation of the poem for the potential reader, and the common themes of death, mirroring, and rebirth. At a little over halfway through the commentary section of the novel, the passage is located in a good place for it to remind the reader of the significance of the second canto of the poem while proceeding and preparing the reader for important turns in the plot that will come later. The note to line 493 is a good example of the ultimate purpose of the novel as a whole, which is to portray Kinbote's attempt to find meaning in his own life, particularly his post-Zemblin life, through the poem of his deceased friend. Most of his commentary reveals the many facets of his being, but it is the note to line 493 that, through the relation of the most important aspects of the novel, uncovers the darkest depths of his soul and vivid imagination. The passage is an example of the dark comedy that Kinbote frequently employs throughout the commentary. Much of it consists of his suggestions for how suicide should be carried out, what methods a man should use and which ones a woman should use, what can go wrong if one makes a mistake while committing the act, etc. Kinbote writes these suggestions nonchalantly. However, that implies that he has given the subject much thought. The thought of suicide does not seem to make him anxious or worried. Instead, he almost seems to welcome it, and he might have suicidal tendencies. Later in the novel, Kinbote comes between Jacob Gratus and Shade in order to prevent the former from shooting the latter. He fails. However, Kinbote's gardener and Sybil Shade, John Shade's wife, think that it was an act of heroism. The note seems to suggest that Kinbote might have had other reasons for coming between Gratus and Shade. Because he thinks that he has already killed himself metaphorically, he thinks that a literal death would not be bad. In this way, the passage once again repeats the theme of death that is found throughout the novel. Towards the end of the novel, Kinbote is asked by another professor of the college whether or not Kinbote was the Zemlin word for regicide. Kinbote answers in the positive. King's destroyer, I said, longing to explain a king who sinks his identity in the mirror of exile is in a sense just that. This is proof that Kinbote thinks that he has committed metaphorical suicide, since he has betrayed himself by going into exile in a foreign land. In the note to line 493, the commentator of Pale Fire tells the reader what he thinks is the best method for committing suicide. The ideal drop is from an aircraft, your muscles relaxed, your pilot puzzled, your packed parachute shuffled off, cast off, shrugged off. Farewell, Shutka, little shoot. At this point in the novel, it is not quite certain if Kinbote is the Zemlin King Charles. It becomes apparent later, however, that his escape to America was foreshadowed in this passage in slightly greater detail than anywhere before in the text. Another example of how this passage can be considered one of the narrative foci of the novel is the opening couplet. I was the shadow of the waxwing slain by the false azure in the window pane. Of course, the waxwing of the line could be referring to John Shade. The couplet describes a bird that is killed when it flies into a window that is reflecting the sky. Shade is killed in the confrontation between a man, Kinbote/King Charles, and another who can be considered his mirror image, Gratus. The couplet could, however, also be referring to Kinbote. In fact, the imagery of those first two lines of the poem suggest Kinbote even more than Shade. In his descent from the airplane, Kinbote would obviously have been in the air, like a bird, and the sky during the day can be described as azure. The second couplet of the poem also describes Kinbote more than Shade. I was the smudge of ashen fluff, and I lived on, flew on, in the reflected sky. Kinbote may have been the perpetrator of his own figurative regicide. However, he did live on in real life. At the end of the book, it appears that Kinbote is awaiting an assassin who is better at his job than Jacob Gratus. But whatever happens, wherever the scene is laid, somebody, somewhere, will quietly set out, a bigger, more respectable, more competent Gratus. Until the day when he does meet his potential executioner, Kinbote will live in a foreign purgatory. Thus, he is living on in the reflected sky. Also, Kinbote appears to think that the afterlife will be pleasant. In fact, a good Zemlin Christian is taught that true faith is not there to supply pictures or maps, but that it should quietly content itself with a warm haze of pleasurable anticipation. This is yet another part of the passage that shows his connection with the first stanza of the poem. He thinks that his religious faith does not show what is clearly in store for him after he dies, pictures, and does not show a clear way to get to the desired afterlife, maps, but that it provides hope for the future. This could be another meaning of lived on, flew on. After an assassin literally kills him, he hopes that he will be able to surrender himself utterly unto the perfect safety of wooed death. Kinbote concludes the passage with a brief assumption. We who burrow in filth every day may be forgiven perhaps the one sin that ends all sins. With this sentence, Kinbote is probably expressing some remorse for his homosexuality, since it is considered sinful in Christian theology. His homosexuality is a topic that comes up often in Pale Fire. Perhaps it is most relevant where Disa, Duchess of Pain, who was King Charles's wife and queen, is concerned. In a particularly striking section of the novel, Kinbote writes that she haunted his dreams. He notes that the reason he had such dreams was because he had a subconscious wish to prove to himself that he really did love her. His dream love for her exceeded in emotional tone in spiritual passion and depth anything he had experienced in his surface existence. This passage is an interesting place to put a declaration of contrition because Kinbote makes it seem genuine here due to the sincerity with which he talks about suicide. The passage in the novel has the same prose style as that of the rest of the commentary. Alliteration is one of the poetic techniques that Nabokov employs. An example comes in the paragraph about the various methods of suicide. Humbler humans have preferred sundry forms of suffocation, and minor poets have even tried such fancy releases as vein tapping in the quadruped tub of a drafty boarding house bathroom. He also uses imagery in Kinbote's imaginative ramblings so that the reader can imagine the commentator's thoughts and experiences with greater detail and thus develop a closer connection with him, e.g., down you go, you somersault in slow motion like a somnolent tumbler pigeon, and sprawl supine on the eiderdown of air, enjoying every last instant of soft, deep, death-padded life, and the voluptuous crucifixion as you stretch yourself in the growing rush, in the nearing swish, and then your loved body's obliteration in the lap of the Lord. The sentence also ends with a metaphor. There is also a good example of wordplay in the word bodkin, which is suggested as one of the tools of suicide for men, which is almost an anagram of Kinbote. This again conveys the idea of Kinbote's metaphorical suicide. In addition to sharing a prose style and themes with other sections of the book, the note to line 493 also contains some allusions to older works of literature. There is first a probable reference to the Brothers Grimm in his analogy between the Christian who believed in an afterlife and a boy named Christopher who believed that the place that he and his family were moving to would be better than their previous home. A more pertinent allusion occurs in the section where Kinbote suggests what methods of suicide are the most suitable for each sex. There are purists who maintain that a gentleman should use a brace of pistols, one for each temple, or a bare bodkin, note the correct spelling, and that the ladies should either swallow a lethal dose or drown with clumsy Ophelia. Ophelia, of course, is a character in Hamlet, a possible bride of the eponymous character who descends into insanity when he accidentally kills her father. She drowns when a branch of a willow tree that she had climbed onto broke, and she fell into the river below. Hazel Shade, John Shade's adult daughter, drowned in the lake at Locken Neck. Here is another very important death in the novel. Kinbote writes about Hazel Shade in the index, deserves great respect, having preferred the beauty of death to the ugliness of life. This is connected with Kinbote's appreciation for death as a state that is more sublime than life. His respect for Hazel Shade is probably derived from the fact that he thought about suicide and contemplated committing it in order to go into that more pleasant state of being, yet did not actually go through with it. The note to line 493 is one of the most intriguing sections of the novel. It is connected closely with many different parts of the novel on a thematic level. Furthermore, the passage contains some very good examples of allusions and the various poetic techniques that Nabokov used throughout the novel. Perhaps most significantly, it allows the reader to gaze into a part of Charles Kinbote's mind that is not truly revealed before, since he, in the midst of trying to extract the meaning of his own life from John Shade's masterpiece, gives his earnest thoughts on suicide, a very troubling subject. These various aspects of the passage combine to make it representative of the entire novel and allow the reader to view what came before it and comes after it in a new light.